The next session that we looked at was really what is African American religion, right? And this was so important to the museum because I realized that most museums in America don't talk about religion. It is something central to communities. It is something that has shaped the lives of millions of people. And yet in museums, what you find are a few artifacts, a Torah here, a sunstone there, a Bible there. And so what excited me was to be able to bring the best scholarship out that talks about how central religion is, but how complicated that is. Whether it is the question of how does African people become Christian, or how is it that religion serves as one of the cornerstones to allow people to affect change?
Well, one of the things that the session did, though, which was interesting to me, was to emphasize that this process was not only how African people became Christian, but how they became all sorts of other things. Yes. Sometimes with becoming Christian as a middle step,
yes.
But often emphasizing the extent to which, if we're going to look at the future of the African American past and the future, what we have to do is broaden our understanding of African American religious practices to be thinking about the multiplicity of religions that one sees practiced in Black communities.
And I think that's really important, right? To be able to sort of say, well, what are the origins of these? How do you have the kind of Father Divines and Sweet Daddy Graces that are part of that sort of urban burst of religiosity in the 30s and 40s and 50s? And then what does it mean as more and more African Americans embrace Islam? And so part of what I thought this session did so well is remind us that regardless of the branch, that spirituality has been so central to how this community defines itself and how it viewed America. And so this, to me, would give many people a way to think about religion and spirituality beyond the way they might do by thinking about going to church on a Sunday, but rather allows them to see that this plays a spiritual role, it plays a secular role, it plays a political role, it plays an economic role. It plays a role to help define America's identity. So in some ways, what excited me about this was that it really looked at the complexity of religion and spirituality in a holistic way.
Well, what I'm hoping is that teachers can use this session to help students ask how race matters. If there's this multiplicity of religions, Islam, Christianity, even Judaism, and other religions that many Americans have never even heard of, then why does it matter that the people who practice these variety of religions are African American? And is the category of African American religion a useful category in thinking about American religious history? And this is something I think that students can wrestle with.
And I think it's also interesting that students can also ask the question that many say the most segregated place in America are churches on Sunday, right? And so to really begin to look at what does it mean that in terms of spirituality, we still are in many ways completely segregated.
And how to look at the institutions that African Americans most control
Yes.
By themselves.
Yes.
Good morning. I'm Jim Grossman, the Executive Director of the American Historical Association, and I want to join my friends and colleagues Lonnie Bunch and Bro Adams in welcoming everyone to this conference on the future of the African American past. For those of you who were here yesterday, Lonnie and Bro did, and Thursday, Lonnie and Bro did the welcomes. And I especially want to join Lonnie in thanking the National Endowment for the Humanities, not only Chairman Adams, but former interim chair Carol Watson, who is here, and who had the faith in what we were doing, I think, in many ways before Lonnie and I did, and judiciously entrusted our collaboration to NEH Director of Public Programs Karen Middleman. and a team of public programs staff and others who offered advice throughout the project. I see Chrissy is here, and I just appreciate all the help that we got. I also want to join Lonnie in emphasizing that Dana Schaefer at the American Historical Association and Deirdre Cross at the National Museum of African American History and Culture are the people who actually made this happen. Those of you who are the speakers and bloggers for the conference are well aware that they have continued to make it run smoothly. It not only was at the beginning. We're also, of course, grateful to John Gray and the staff, Director John Gray and the staff of the National Museum of American History for loaning us their facilities for the weekend. It was very generous of them. We had intended originally to be in the building across the way, which I recommend that everybody, at least even in the rain, go outside and take a look at. But it took a little long. Sometimes anybody who's renovated their home knows that sometimes construction takes a little bit longer than you expect. This particular building has special importance to both Lonnie and me. Lonnie talked a little bit about that yesterday and worked here, on Thursday, worked here for a long time. In my case, this is where I first participated in a sort of small, specialized conference that establishes lifetime friendships in our business. Adrian Petty yesterday mentioned the landmark exhibition in this museum, Field to Factory. What she probably didn't know is that a conference associated with that exhibit is where Lonnie and I first met and where I first encountered a remarkable community of scholars, many of whom have become lasting friends and colleagues. So I will always be grateful to the National Museum of American History. Finally, I want to acknowledge the support of History, formerly known as the History Channel, and in particular, Senior Historian and Vice President Kim Gilmore, who can't be with us, is back visiting with family in Kansas City, but has asked me to remind everybody that the remake of Roots will air on Memorial Day at 9 p.m. The website is roots.history.com. I have seen the first episode. It is not the same as last time. So it is very much not the same as last time. I also want to thank the universities who have sponsored their students to attend. And I am now going to sheepishly admit that I left in my bag the names of the universities, and so I can't name them. But we appreciate your support, and I apologize. Now, I have a question for everybody, because it's one of the things we're curious about. How many people are District of Columbia area, local people who are here? And how many traveled? Okay, so it's about half-half. We were kind of curious. There's all sorts of other things we're curious about, but I'm not going to conduct a survey here. I do want to remind everybody that there are many people tweeting. There is a hashtag, future AA past, and we've had huge numbers, at least for us, of people using the hashtag. Nearly 4,000 tweets have been sent yesterday, and what was interesting was that they were not, as often happens, just coming from 7 or 8 different people. They were coming from many, many different people, many of them who are not even here. The conference is also being live streamed and is being archived on the conference website. If you go to that website, which is futureafampast.si.edu, you can also see a blog, an ongoing blog about the conference. The first piece is already up, which is on the session the Thursday night session. And the other ones will be going up very soon. People have actually told me that they have written them, so they're being edited. We're trying to get these up as quickly as possible. And these blogs are very short pieces, responses to the session. The first one is a wonderful, not only summary of the session, but also very sharp take on some of the interpretive aspects of it, which is what we asked people to do. So I encourage you to go and take a look at these. So the live stream, we had about 80 to a couple of hundred people watching yesterday from cities around the United States and beyond. So it's clear that we have a lot of interest, which is very gratifying to us. When I got here this morning at about quarter to 8, there were people waiting outside in the rain. I cannot begin to tell you how happy it makes historians that there are people waiting outside in the rain to come to a history conference. Next week I'm going to a meeting that's focusing on the relevance of history to everything. The AHA has a hashtag, a Twitter hashtag, everything has a history. And this is something that we deeply believe, that it doesn't matter what you're interested in, it has a history, and that history matters. And it's wonderful to see this many people realizing that this is the case. So I'm going to turn the morning over to Edna Medford, who is from Howard University. Edna is going to introduce this session and get us started for today. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful rainy day in Washington, D.C. I am honored to be the chair of this panel, which attempts to answer the simple yet in many ways complex question, what is African American religion? Africans in America, at least the vast majority, were by law chattel, to be bought and sold, exploited unapologetically, and often cast aside once every ounce of value had been extracted. But unlike the livestock that was listed alongside them on estate inventories and at auctions, this peculiar brand of property fought to assert and preserve their humanity in their relationships with each other, in the establishment and operation of their social institutions, and especially in their sacred beliefs. Peoples of African descent adopted a belief system that reflected their diverse ethnicities and the particular circumstances that shaped their lives and labor. Time and experiences altered and redefined the beliefs and practices familiar to the ancestors. The descendants of these men and women adopted new ways of looking at the world and their place in it. But like those before them, they embraced religion as a means to challenge as well as cope with the realities of their existence in America. Institutionalized religion, represented by the Black church, constituted the core of the African American community and freedom. It was the center of training for Black leadership, the first responder in a time of crisis, the linchpin that connected Black people in common cause, including in protest of their oppression. Growing up in rural Virginia in the 60s, I could scarcely imagine that there was any religious experience beyond my own. For me, African American religion was Christian-based, male-dominated. Men comprised the leadership, but women were the worker bees, as they still are today. It was church-centered and emotionally charged. The version I experienced, rooted in the Southern Baptist tradition, meant 2-hour Sunday service. Apparently, our ministers had never heard the old adage that no souls are saved after the first 60 minutes. There was robust preaching, primarily hellfire and brimstone, to be exact. Older ladies being overcome with the Holy Ghost, and music that would inspire godly behavior, at least for a day or two. I had graduated from high school and enrolled at Hampton Institute, not Hampton University, Hampton Institute, so you know how long ago that was, before I ever heard of the AME Church. Methodism was for white folk. So there were 11 churches, 11 Black churches in my county. Every single one of them was a Baptist church. Black Hebrews did not exist in my sacred world, nor did perceived alternative groups such as those founded by Daddy Grace and Father Divine and Elijah Muhammad. So you can imagine how far in the backwoods I was, okay, if we really didn't have that Muslim presence there. Of course, my experience was one of many narratives that helped to define African American religion. This morning, each of our panelists either extends or challenges the traditional narrative. Our first panelist is Professor Eddie Glaude, Chair of the Department of African American Studies and William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. His discussion of the category of African American religion will be followed by Judith Weisenfeld, the Agate Brown and George L. Collard Professor of Religion at Princeton University, who will discuss sites and sources for the study of the African American religious past. Now, the lineup was a little bit different, but we have a panel of very feisty rebels here. And so they've decided that it didn't make a lot of sense to have the order that I had placed them in, and I agree with them totally. The lesson there is to always ask your panelists what they think. Okay, don't assume that you know. The third presenter will be, let me just indicate, Professor Weisenfeld will talk, I indicated we'll talk about sites and sources for the study of African American religious past. She will be followed by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Victor S. Thomas, Professor of History and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, who will address Bible politics of the Black freedom struggle. And last but certainly not least is Anthea Butler, and I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing your name. Is it Anthea or Anthea? Okay, wonderful. Who's Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She will discuss African American religion outside of the Black church, rethinking the framework. And so we'll start with Professor Glaude.
Thank you, Sister Edna. Welcome to early morning service. I want to thank the organizers for thinking of me and inviting me to this extraordinary conversation. I've learned a lot. It's been a long time coming, Brother Lonnie, to see this happen. And I am delighted, and words can't really express. Jim, thank you for everything that you do. And thank all of you for being here. So let me just jump into this. I was thinking early this morning when I got up at some ungodly hour in preparation for this about lumpers and splitters. And I was thinking about the great Isaiah Berlin's distinction between hedgehogs and foxes. And I tend not to identify myself as either one. I like to take myself to be more attentive to what hedgehogs and foxes do, what splitters and lumpers take themselves to be up to. So this is what I'm going to try to do today. Is that all right? Okay, good. So what is African American religion? An informative body of literature has been written about the difficulties in the study of religion generally. Many of the concerns evidenced in these conversations, debates about whether religion is reducible to some other more fundamental notion like the unconscious and the like, are interestingly complicated when we think about religion in tandem with race. Or more specifically, the issue becomes even messier when the modifier Black or African American describes religion. These adjectives bear the unusual burden of a difficult history that colors the way religion is practiced and understood in the United States. They register the horror of slavery and the terror of Jim Crow, as well as the richly textured experiences of a captured people for whom sorrow stands alongside joy. It is in this context, one characterized by the ever-present need to account for one's presence in the world in the face of white supremacy, that African American religion takes on such significance. Now, I want to make a distinction between African American religion and African American religious life. African American religious life is not reducible to those wounds, however. Where's Walter? No, I'm sorry. African American religious life is not reducible to those wombs. That life contains within it avenues for solace and comfort in God, answers to questions about who we take ourselves to be and about our relation to the mysteries of the universe. Moreover, meaning is found. Oh, Lord, I got it all backwards. Meaning is found for some in submission to God and obedience to creed and dogma and in ritual practice. Here, evil is accounted for and hope, at least for some, is assured. In short, African American religious life is as rich and as complicated as the religious life of other groups in the United States. But African American religion emerges in the encounter between faith in all of its complexity and white supremacy. Now, let me explain what I mean. My approach assumes that the political and social context in the United States is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition of any study of something called African American religion. If the phrase African American religion is to have any descriptive usefulness at all, it must signify something more than African Americans who are religious. In fact, African Americans practice a number of different religions. There are black people who are Buddhist, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormon, and Baha'i. But that African Americans practice these traditions does not lead us, historians, critics, and the like, to describe it as Black Buddhism or Black Mormonism, right? African American religion singles out something more substantive than that. Right? This something more does not have to be an idea of religion which stands apart from social and historical forces that impinge on the lives of African Americans, right? Nor does it refer to a definite kind of experience that is itself religious or a religious consciousness as distinct from other forms of consciousness. I'm not Schleiermacher. My aim here is not to secure the unique status of the category of African American religion as of its own kind. The adjective refers instead to a racial context within which religious meanings have been produced and reproduced. Y'all all right? Okay, I just want to check on it, right? I will defer consideration of how religion has produced particular racial meanings, but the history of slavery and racial discrimination in the United States birthed particular religious formations among African Americans. African Americans converted to Christianity, for example, in the context of slavery. Many left predominantly white denominations to form their own after experiencing racial proscription and in pursuit of a sense of self-determination. Some embraced a distinctive interpretation of Islam to make sense of their condition in the United States. Given that history, we can reasonably and accurately describe certain variants of Christianity and Islam as African American and mean something beyond the rather uninteresting claim that Black individuals belong to these different religious traditions. Now, of course, African American religious practices can be understood apart from the social and political context that in some ways call them into being, and there are numerous studies that do just that. Attention to context, however, helps to explain why the scholar has called the particular religious formation African American religion. In other words, the phrase is the invention of those of us who, with aims and purposes, particular aims and purposes, seek to describe, analyze, and theorize the religious practices of African Americans under a particular racial regime. I'm going to do this really quickly. Okay? This is what you get for inviting a philosopher to a history conference. The words Black or African American work as markers of difference, in my view, as a way of signifying a tradition of struggle against white supremacist practices and a cultural repertoire that reflects that unique journey as evidenced in religious meanings produced under certain conditions. The phrase calls up a particular history and culture in our efforts to understand the religious practices of a particular people. So when I use the phrase African American religion, I'm not referring to something that can be defined substantively apart from the thicket of various practices. Rather, my aim is to orient you, the reader, in a particular way to the material under consideration, to call attention to the social political history that informs the topic at hand, and to single out the workings of the human imagination and spirit under particular conditions. Sentences that begin, African American religion is, are rarely simply descriptive. They typically convey certain normative assumptions about what that religion is, has been, and ought to be, like African American religion is prophetic or African American religion is emotional. But to understand the sentence African American religion is only in this way risks the problem of reifying a particular understanding of Black religious practices, of denying complexity, ambiguity, and contradiction by snatching varied practices out of the messiness of history. I like mess. Right? It's much better to understand such utterances as procedures of differentiation and invocation, as a way of saying that you ought to give more attention to this as opposed to that, and a recollection of history that makes the distinction worthwhile. When Howard Thurman the Great, I'm going to bring it home, when Howard Thurman the great 20th century black theologian declared that the slave dared to redeem the religion profaned in his midst, he offered a particular understanding of black Christianity. This expression of Christianity was not the idolatrous embrace of Christian doctrine, right? Christian doctrine that justified the superiority of white people and the subordination of black people. Instead, black Christianity embraced the liberating power of Jesus' example, his sense that all, no matter their situation in life, were children of God. Thurman sought to orient the reader then to a specific inflection of Christianity in the hands of those who lived as slaves. Now think about the negative formulation of the sentence. This ain't African-American religion. This ain't black church. I have to say ain't instead of isn't. Such sentences say more about the commitments of the person who utters them than the actual religious practices. What is being noted here is the absence of something, that some essential element of what constitutes African-American Christianity is missing. So I go through this in the paper that you have online, right? I'm trying to make a distinction between how African-American religion works, right? How we need to understand the way in which these categories take us into the thicket of actual practices, right? They bring certain things into view and they keep other things out of view. And what I'm thinking about is what happens when the category actually isn't doing the kind of work that we expect it to do. How do we think of black Christianity with Nigerian Pentecostals? How do we think about, right, the ways in which the African-American religious landscape has changed such that this Protestant bias or this Protestant inflection keeps us from seeing, right, all of the complexity on the ground? So in other words, I think we need to think carefully about, right, the descriptive work or the analytic work that the category is doing, where it's guiding us, where it's leading us to. And if it's getting in the way, then it's about time we get rid of it. Thank you.
I think with images and through images and about images, and so I wanted to offer you some images from my work. You're good? All right. My goal today is to suggest ways to broaden our scope for the study of African American religious history beyond the traditional focus on Protestantism and black churches. And needless to say, we miss the full complexity of this history if we attend only to a dominant tradition using the conventional sources that emerge from its theological and institutional context. And in framing my remarks this way, I certainly do not mean to argue that this dominant tradition of Protestantism, as located primarily in black church denominations, is not worthy of scholarly attention. In considering the future of the African American religious past, however, I believe it is vital that we expand our scope of inquiry. And this work involves, in part, acknowledging the fact of religious diversity in African American religious life, as Eddie has talked about, and devoting more attention to Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Baha'is, practitioners of Vodou and Santeria, humanists and secularists, for example. Beyond charting a more diverse set of traditions and centering women, gender, and sexuality in our work, for example, I'm interested in what new understandings of and perspectives on African American religious history emerge when we bring sites and sources other than churches and clergy into view. And I offer three sources I have encountered in my own research on early 20th century African American religious history that have led me to broaden my view of the sites and social actors of that history. So in 1941, veteran actor and director Spencer Williams released The Blood of Jesus, the first in a set of 3 religious movies he planned to make in the course of the decade, and he did make Go Down Death and Brother Martin, Servant of Jesus. There's a trailer. It's unclear whether he made it and it was lost or whether he never got to make it. These films were part of the broader landscape of race films produced for black audiences, and that by this period had begun to decline in production and popularity. With The Blood of Jesus, Williams struck out beyond his comedic specialty as an actor in seeking to deliver a message of Christian redemption in an entertaining package. While not unique in mobilizing this combination of entertainment and evangelism on screen, Williams was, by all accounts, uniquely successful in appealing to African American viewers who saw his films in movie theaters, churches, and school and community auditoriums. The Blood of Jesus is about gender, sexuality, family, urbanization, small-town church life, and popular culture. And Williams places the character of Martha, played by Catherine Cavanis, at the center of the film's story. Although set in a Christian context, the narrative and visual focus on Martha's trials and redemption highlight women as central figures in Black religious life, and Williams presents a complex portrait of theology and religious community with only passing reference to church or male clergy. My work to analyze the film itself, the material culture of advertising, the careers of the director and actors, and exhibition and reception rendered the movie theater a productive site for the study of African American religious history. My sources called on me to think about the cinema not only as a cultural, social, and political environment, as many scholars of early Black film have demonstrated, but also a religious one that viewers of Williams films and other early 20th century religious films engaged as such. Bringing media and popular culture more fully into African American religious history opens up new ways of thinking about the production and dissemination of ideas about religion, but also the mediation of religious experience. In the course of researching a recent project on the Black new religious movements of the Great Migration, I turned to an online database of visual records to learn more about Wentworth Arthur Matthew, an immigrant from St. Kitts and rabbi of Harlem's Commandment Keepers Ethiopian Hebrew congregation. Because personal narratives of racial and religious origins were central to how Black Hebrew leaders in Harlem promoted their theological and identity claims, I was interested in Matthew's assertion at various points that he had been born in Nigeria. The result of my search showed that in the official record, Matthew most often gave his birthplace as St. Kitts. But one source, his World War II draft registration card from April 26, 1942, raised a host of other questions for me about individual and collective understandings of the relationship between religious and racial identity for Blacks in early 20th century America. And we see on this card that Matthew considered his clerical title of rabbi to be so important that he squeezed it in above his name and also included it in his signature. On the other portion of the registration card, Matthew asked for an amendment to the government-supplied list of racial designators, requesting that Hebrew be added to represent properly his sense of his linked religious and racial identity. Matthew's request led me to wonder whether he was alone in this. And the draft registration records turned out to have hundreds of documents from members of what I have come to call religio-racial movements, who, like Matthew, challenged the power of the state to define them solely according to race, and from their perspective, the wrong race, and insisted on being represented according to what they understood to be an intertwined religio-racial identity. Within the archive, I found members of Father Divine's peace mission movement, such as Perfect Endurance, a migrant to Harlem from Georgia, who, in keeping with Father Divine's theology that race is a negative construct of the mind, asked that he be listed simply as human. The registrar complied, but wrote his requested designation above the supplied category of Negro. Alec Brown Bay, a migrant to Philadelphia from South Carolina and a member of the Moorish Science Temple, insisted that he was Moorish American. He also persuaded the registrar to characterize his complexion, hair color, and eye color as olive, a theological term many Moorish Americans used to describe themselves. And we also see that the registrar pushed back in the section where he had to affirm the truth of the information. He wrote that he believed Brown Bay was actually a Negro. Now, in the course of my research, I came to see such bureaucratic paperwork, vital records such as marriage and death certificates, and government documents like census sheets, draft registration cards, and immigration paperwork, as rich and complex records of aspects of life within the religio-racial movements. Reading with, through, and against such documents illuminates the race-making and maintenance work members of these religious groups undertook in daily life and in public contexts, and calls on us to consider sites like the draft board, the county clerk's office, the immigration judge's courtroom, the military base, as ones both of exercise of state power and of religious expression and experience, sometimes in challenge to state power. In 1913, law enforcement and medical officials decided that Mary F. Wood, a 48-year-old Missouri native living in north central California, should be committed to the Stockton State Hospital for the Insane. The commitment paperwork indicates that Wood, a Methodist, had, quote, walked the streets crying, "Glory be to God," singing, reading scripture, and preaching, etc., will not sleep night or day, wanted to be appointed as a preacher in the local church. Here's the rest of that form. The diagnosis was of insanity, accompanied by fixed religious delusions, and the intake psychiatrist listed religion as a predisposing factor. Street preaching, evangelizing, and the desire to preach at a local church are not obvious indicators of mental illness. Although it seems to me that gendered and racialized understandings of religious leadership may have played a role in the deputy sheriff's sense that Wood was disruptive somehow. In Wood's case, these religious expressions were situated in the context of an ongoing manic state that produced sleeplessness and exhaustion, leading to her death 8 days after admission to the hospital. On its own, this document is not particularly revealing of aspects of the African American religious past beyond those of an individual's religious expression and psychological distress. But placed in the larger context of early 20th century psychiatric discourses and practices about race and religion, it directs us to a set of sources and new sites for inquiry. Wood was among many early 20th century African Americans who were remanded by courts or committed by family members to psychiatric institutions and diagnosed with some form of religiously grounded mental illness. Scholars of the history of racialization of mental illness in a variety of contexts in Africa and the African diaspora have emphasized the use of diagnosis, institutionalization, and treatment as a mode of containment of individual and group acts of resistance. Few scholars have attended to the way that discourses about Black religion shaped the diagnostic categories psychiatrists in the U.S. created, the process of diagnosis, and the practices of treatment. Early 20th century psychiatric literature about African Americans is filled with assertions about enduring Negro savagery, manifest particularly in religion, that many psychiatrists understood to continue to shape African American traits of character, habit, and behavior. While such discourses about African American religion were commonplace in early 20th century American culture, the page of the Stockton State Hospital's commitment register that marks Mary Wood's admission just days before her death have led me to examine psychiatric literature that might reveal more about the intersection of African American religious history and the history of disability in the form of mental illness. Wondering about Mary Wood's life, her religious commitments and aspirations, and her experience in the Stockton State Hospital also require that I turn to the mental institution as a site for the study of the African American religious past. How might Wood's diagnosis as suffering from religious insanity have guided the treatment she received from doctors? And did ideas about race and religion play a role in her commitment, treatment, and eventual death? In putting these three documents from my research before you, I hope to highlight the rich possibilities of engaging sources and sites beyond the scope of the conventional ones through which we have traditionally told the story of African American religious history. As is clear, these sources and sites sometimes emerge from or have deep connections to those traditional arenas of religious life, but they raise new sets of questions and highlight new social actors. And in addition to turning from the almost exclusive attention to Black Protestant churches and political struggle in the past, turning from this helps us to interpret the texture and complexity of the current religious landscape that includes theological developments like the prosperity gospel that have had influence beyond Black communities, varieties of Islam among African Americans, the impact of immigration from the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa in Black religious life, new forms of spirituality not tied to Christian institutions, new religious spaces that center Black queer presence, and more. So a more textured understanding of the African American religious past helps to situate these in a much longer history of variety, creativity, contestation, and change that has always characterized Black religious life in America. Thank you.
Good morning. It is indeed an honor and pleasure to be here, and I'm so appreciative of Jim Grossman and Lonnie Bunch and all who have made this possible. I have, as someone else said the other day, seen friends I haven't seen in 40 years. So it's really wonderful to be here. I want to talk to you about the Bible politics of the Black freedom struggle. Today, most Americans, upon hearing the term Bible politics, would associate it with the religious right, with the conservative evangelical wing of the Republican Party. Yet its etymology tells of different roots, specifically that of radical abolitionists in the 1840s and 1850s, who believed that God's laws and justice lay at the very foundation of civil government and laws. Unlike the followers of William Lloyd Garrison, who disdained the Constitution and who sought the immediate end to slavery through moral suasion, the abolitionists who followed Bible politics professed the gospel of liberty through political discourses and institutions. And historians like Milton Surnett and John Stauffer, James Brewer Stewart, and most recently Manisha Sinha, observe the term Bible politics that was coined by these abolitionists, specifically those in third-party politics, the Liberty Party and its successors, particularly the Radical Abolition Party. These abolitionists proclaimed the gospel of liberty in order to end the sin of slavery. However, despite the coinage in this specific context, Bible politics so precisely captures the fusion of religion and politics. It so succinctly comprehends the interlocking discourses of religion, race, law, and rights that I argue for its analytical usefulness over a much more expansive period. What I am calling the Bible politics of the Black freedom struggle rests on the distinction between obedience to natural, divine law and civil, man-made law. It rejects as artificial the binary between the religious and the political by emphasizing God's law, a higher moral law, as the basis of civil law and as the moral referent for evaluating the validity of civil laws. What makes it distinct is the centrality of religious ideas in bringing about racial equality and justice through the American government's ideals, documents, processes, and institutions. And when you see it online, I talk about where you can see religious language in the Declaration of Independence. You also see religious language in these Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke. Attention to religious language reveals the perceived linkage between the universal ideals in the Bible and the natural law ideals of the American nation, as presented in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But it also reveals the centuries-long contestation over the meaning and application of laws and rights, a contestation in which both sides, both the anti-slavery side and the pro-slavery side, both the civil rights workers and the segregationists, are validating their perspectives by using the same foundational text, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bible. For much of American history, the fusion of religion and politics has undergirded white supremacy and the subordination of Black people. Racial purity laws, for example, these racial purity laws expose the most fundamental expression of the long-standing inseparability of race, religion, politics, and natural law. So let me give you an example from the state of Virginia. Because in the state of Virginia, as early as this is a colony now, in 1662, Virginia legislators sought to curb interracial sex and the colony's growing mixed-race population by increasing a punitive fine from yet an earlier law. So the laws actually predate 1662. And the law of 1662 says, if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Black man or woman, he or she is so offending, shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. And the law was really meant to curb mulattoes And it was also very much targeted to women, because if you were a white woman and you had a mixed-race child, that child would not be a slave. It would inherit the status of the mother. It's also interesting that this law uses the word Christian for white people. And while you might think, well, that's interesting, and maybe black people didn't go to church, that's not true, because some of the cases are black and white churchgoers. But more importantly, I would like you to think about the post-Brown decision, when many schools in counties in Virginia closed. In fact, these I shouldn't say they just simply closed. Counties of Virginia closed public schools to resist the Brown decision. When they opened their white schools, often they were called Christian schools. So that law in 1662, we can go up until the Loving case. And many of us know about the Loving case. Richard and Mildred Loving were an interracial couple who really took their marriage to the Supreme Court in 1967, and it was validated as a legal marriage. But in 1965, this is on the way to the Supreme Court, the circuit judge in Caroline County said that their marriage was illegal. And he talked about states' rights, but he also added this dictum: Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix. So this is actually in the legal document of 1965, and they were actually in jail. They had spent some time in jail until in the process of fighting for this. Get back to my other page here. So the Bible politics of the Black freedom struggle offers a counter-narrative. It offers a competing normative universe. It exists as a combination of principles that also continued over the centuries, and I will identify them as follows. One is the biblically validated oneness of humanity, and this is based on the book of Acts in the Bible, chapter 17, verse 26, God hath made the nations of one blood. And based on that, the argument goes, and it goes from literally the colonial period to today, that because of that, humanity is one, and so freedom is a natural condition of all persons. And then the second point is the sacred quality of the Declaration of Independence and the liberating spirit of the Constitution. And number three, the recognition of just laws and unjust laws with emphasis on obedience to just laws. 4, the essentiality of a multiracial coalition for lasting success. And 5, the moral obligation on the part of African Americans to make America live up to its ideals. So I give examples in the paper. The first is from the Revolutionary War era and the early Republic. Next is from the time of the abolitionists, and finally from the 20th century. And in the earliest period, I draw from the public addresses and writings of the Black New Englander, Lemuel Haynes. He was a soldier in the Continental Army. He was a theologian and an ordained Congregationalist minister. In 1776, so the war is going on, he writes an essay called Liberty Further Extended. And what he argues is that the Revolutionary War could not usher in true American liberty until freedom was extended to the black slaves. In all of these narratives, there's a story about the unfinished business of America. Haynes based his anti-slavery argument on the Bible and the Declaration of Independence when he wrote that freedom was the natural condition of mankind. And I quote him, "Liberty and freedom is an innate principle, which is unmovably placed in the human species, and to see man aspire after it is not enigmatical, seeing he acts in no ways incompatible with his own nature. Liberty is a jewel which was handed down to man from the cabinet of heaven. It proceeds from the supreme legislature of the universe." And so building on this rationale, he goes on to explain why slavery is an unjust system. And he distinguishes between just and unjust laws to the rights of blacks by saying every privilege, and I'm quoting him again, every privilege that mankind enjoy have their origin from God, and whatever acts are passed in any earthly court, which are derogatory to those edicts that are passed in the court of heaven, the act is void. And Martin Luther King will use that same just and unjust laws 100 years later. In fact, the language is very similar. The appeal to the moral, even liberating context of the Constitution in the face of perceived unjust law can be seen in December 30th, 1799, in a petition to Congress by Absalom Jones and other free black citizens of Philadelphia. And in the petition of color, it's called the Petition of the People of Color, freemen within the city and the suburbs of Philadelphia, there's 70 signatories, focused on, some of them just put X's by their names, but they focused on the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. They were conscious of exercising their rights as citizens. The black petitioners acknowledged both their own enjoyment of the natural right to liberty and their sense of duty to speak for the slaves. And I quote them, "Our afflicted brethren, suffering under various circumstances in different parts of these states, but deeply sympathizing with them." So scholarship in the last decade or so on abolitionists, now I'm moving to the second period, scholarship on this third party, radical abolition party, also shows that you have these same kind of sentiments. Although overwhelmingly white in membership, the Liberty Party, the Radical Abolition Party, welcomed blacks as members and delegates to their meetings. So, for example, the 1844 platform made explicit its invitation, quote, "for our colored fellow citizens to fraternity with us in the Liberty Party." And both parties nominated black persons for office on their national tickets. Most recently, Manisha Sinha, in her comprehensive study of abolitionism, identifies a number of leading black abolitionists within the Liberty Party. African Americans were a minority in that party. They were a minority in the United States, and therefore they formed their own conventions at the state and national levels, while also participating in the political parties like the Liberty Party and the Radical Abolition parties. So black leaders like Henry Highland Garnet, Samuel Ringgold Ward, and the fugitive slave Henry Bibb campaigned for the Liberty Party. However, it's interesting that at the same time that they're doing this campaigning, Henry Highland Garnet, he's proudly identifying with the Liberty Party. Garnet is also remembered for his fiery address at the National Negro Convention in Buffalo in 1843, where he urged the slaves to rise up against their masters in the manner of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. And Garnet's speech was long remembered for his fiery resistance, he said, resistance. And yet that very speech also included the familiar rhetoric of the Bible politics of the black freedom struggle. And I quote Garnet, "Sages admired it." He's talking about the Declaration of Independence. "Sages admired it. The Declaration of Independence was a glorious document, and the patriotic of every nation reverenced the godlike sentiments which it contained." He then proceeded to condemn the Founding Fathers for their limited embrace of universal rights. And then I read him again. "When the power of government returned to their hands, did they emancipate the slaves? No. They rather added new links to our chains. In every man's mind, the good seeds of liberty are planted, and he who brings his fellow down so low as to make him content with a condition of slavery commits the higher crime against such laws." Now, violence found expression in the Radical Abolition Party. And John Stauffer talks about, for example, Frederick Douglass, who used to be a follower of Garrison, and now he has become, by the 1850s, after 1850, a radical abolitionist. And he writes in his newspaper, "We want men at this crisis who cannot be frightened from the advocacy of our radical doctrines because of their unpopularity. Let us not then grow weary, but believing that whatever is right is practicable, go forth with renewed determination to conquer, though we die in the conflict." And at that inaugural Radical Abolition Party meeting was John Brown, who would go on to Kansas and then a few years later to Harper's Ferry. So from the founding of the civil rights activism of the 1960s, the Bible politics of the freedom struggle has continuously maintained the theme of purifying America, of making America live up to its ideals, or as Martin Luther King stated with regard to the Constitution on April 3rd, 1968, the day before he died, all we say to America is to be true to what you said on paper. Bible politics has been pursued through overwhelmingly Black organizations and through alliances on a multiracial basis. Thus, the Southern Leadership Conference, which was led by Martin Luther King, adopted the slogan, "To save the soul of America," while at that same time it promoted nonviolent disobedience to unjust laws of the 1950s and 60s. But LCLC, along with other civil rights organizations, also believed that the gains toward racial justice must come through laws, executive orders, and judicial opinions. This would entail not only interracial, all-Black efforts, but also alliances across the races, despite the complications, despite the setbacks occurring in each context. And I want to end the paper with examples from women. Betty Collier-Thomas, in her book, Jesus, Jobs, and Justice, discusses the fusion of religion and politics by the activities of Black church women who engaged in electoral politics and in fighting for the passage of legislation such as anti-lynching laws and the civil rights laws. So for over decades, she identifies less familiar names. One is a woman named Florence Spearing Randolph, who was an AME Zion minister. She actually pastored a church, but yet she was very much involved in Republican women's organizations, Black women's and white women's, from the 1920s to the 1940s. And I'll also mention Jennifer Scanlon's wonderful new biography on Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who was involved in the March on Washington movement in 1941, as well as the interracial Christian organizations in the 1960s. And these organizations lobbied for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I conclude that we need to see more about the political activism of the religious people in America, and Black people in particular, because the Bible politics of the Black liberation struggle is undoubtedly an important intervention in African American and American history. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank everyone for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Every time I pass by the museum, I look at it, I think, this is the right jewel in the crown on the mall. And it's gorgeous. If you looked at my paper online, you can think of that as the historiographical essay to go with what I'm going to say now, which you don't know what I'm going to say now, which will probably make a few people nervous. I want to start off by telling a story that encapsulates not only my interest in history and religion, but the ways in which African American religion is always present, whether you recognize it or not. I gained my love of history not only from my mother, but my high school teacher, my history teacher, Wayne Ford, outside of Houston, Texas. Mr. Ford was always a dapper dresser, came to school really sharp, briefcase always very neatly organized. And he was very patient with me when I asked way too many questions in the classroom and harassed him with questions after class. When I graduated from high school, he told me that he was retiring soon and that he'd be buying a drugstore in Houston, Texas, and that I should come and visit him. I didn't understand why he was buying a drugstore. I mean, he's not a pharmacist. But I thought, sure, I'll come over. So my best friend and I traveled to 2718 Lyons Avenue in Houston's Fifth Ward to Stanley's drugstore. When we walked in, I was stunned to see wax candles in the shape of men and women and sort of body parts, but you can guess what those were. Oils, powders, and my former history teacher standing behind the counter with his brow arched behind his huge glasses, waiting on a customer. My history teacher was a hoodoo man. And I never knew it. And he probably put something on me and I don't even know. Needless to say, my mind was blown. I had to rethink everything about what I knew about Dr. Ford, as his customers called him. This new business of oils and powders and candles that he was surrounded by were very exciting to me. And I had a whole new set of questions. Meanwhile, my best friend was trying to find the right oil in order to get the most tips out of her waitressing job that summer. I need to tell y'all it worked. Don't, judge me, but I know historians don't like to talk about that kind of stuff, but there you go. If you think this is an aberration, please take a look at this week's LA Times, in which Stanley's drugstore is still going strong and is featured in a great article by Molly Hennessy Fisk with a picture of Stephanie May, niece to Dr. Ford, who now currently runs the store. I relate this story because I suspect many of us, while looking for the traditional markers of African American religion, look to the Protestant Black church. You think of a choir, you think of a dynamic preacher, you think of women in hats, but we miss the quotidian ways in which religion is practiced right in front of us by African Americans. Many of you who have relatives who wouldn't eat at somebody's house, or had somebody who told you not to comb your hair in certain places, or had different practices and tics that you might have thought were spiritual in nature or just superstition, but you paid little thought about where they came from. I've been thinking a lot in the past few years about an alternative narrative to get at African American religion. And in the spirit of thinking about the word future in the title of this conference, I want to think and explore a future in which we consider a different trajectory for the broader field of research and writing about Black religion and history. So many of the great histories that have been written take the arc of the slave religion, the establishment of Black churches like the AME and National Baptist Convention, to the civil rights movement and beyond. I call this the triumphal narrative of freedom, except we know that in today's world, freedom ain't free, and that sometimes the freedom you think you get is not really there. I want to be clear that I don't think that we should stop doing the history of Black churches, but I do think it is time to destroy this idea of the Black church that has held African American religion in thrall. And what I mean by that is this. If we take the whole narrative about the spiritual lives of African Americans and we frame that only within the specter of Protestant Black churches, then we miss the entirety of what Black religion is all about. We miss the whole story. We make the people who have these stories, we put them in a second place, in a second category, and that is not what we should do. Because if we think about Protestantism, it has an inherent bias of patriarchal norms that are reinforced by scripture, and in part, that whole narrative also got inculcated within the work of anthropologists and sociologists who wrote about Black religion in the early parts of the 20th century. And a lot of those representations of Black religion have also influenced historians. And so this idea about Black religion that exists outside of a church frame or a Protestant frame is always seen as other. It's aberrant, it's primitive. I think there is another way to think about that arc of African American religion, and I want to frame my remarks today in light of an essay in the Journal of Africana Religions by Tracy Hucks and Diane Diakite, which is entitled Africana Religious Studies Towards a Transdisciplinary Agenda in an Emerging Field. Hucks and Diakite propose that the study of Africana religions must disconnect itself from the previous debates posited by Melville Hurwitz, E. Franklin Frazier, and others, especially theologians, suggesting that in researching and making available the diversity of U.S. African American religious cultures and the range of encounters and exchanges that have produced them, secular historians have much to offer religionists. And I think that's true, and that is the case. Historians have often pointed us to stories that we didn't know. But on the other hand, I think that those of us who do religious history have a very we have a very firm responsibility to do this work in a different way. I want to engage Hucks and Diakite's insightful essay to consider how opening up our history to this diversity helps us to consider a profoundly different historical arc of African Americans and religions. Instead of that narrative from slave religion to freedom, we must connect to the African past. I think this is crucial. We haven't talked very much on this panel this morning about the ways in which Africa looms as a presence, and we need to be able to begin to think back and how we're going to do this narrative over again and make that narrative more clearly connect to African antecedents of religion. And that would include Christianity and, in some sense, Congolese Catholicism and other things like Islam and African traditional religions. It brings into sharp relief the geographic and regional aspects of African American religion, and we can cut these in a different way if we eliminate this black church thing that's happening. And following this trajectory can tell us so much more about slavery, migration, freedom, the urban space, and the future. Put another way, by considering this history outside of Christianity, we open up space for the creative ways in which African Americans use religion as a way to make a creative space, to create identity, to connect to the diaspora, and to manage their everyday lives and give them self-determination and worth in a racist society. In order to do that, I want to talk about 3 different stories this morning that I think speak to that narrative of difference. And you might be surprised about a couple of them, not so much because you might not know them, because of the ones that I've chosen make a representation of certain kinds of stories. The first is a story about C.H. Mason in the Church of God in Christ. The second is a story about Father Maurice Rousseff, who is a priest, a black priest in the Society for Divine Word. And the third is Johnny Coleman. The first is Charles Harrison Mason. You probably know Mason as the co-founder of the Church of God in Christ, a church I wrote about in my first book, and he was the first presiding bishop. What many people don't know outside of those who study Pentecostalism is that there's a very famous picture of Mason with his roots in signs and wonders of nature. And in this picture, he's holding different kinds of potatoes and tree branches, things like this, that all spoke to him that he said were part of God's wonders of creation, but he also used them to pray over people and heal them. In the past, people wrote about Mason as someone who was caring for slave religion, but we might think about those antecedents as going back even further than just slave religion. They go back to Africa. And in a book about Mason, All of This in the Life and Ministry of Charles Harrison Mason, he has a picture of him with his roots, but it also talks about how he used those roots to preach from Scripture, to talk about the wonders of God, the wonders of Jesus, and all this. And this fusion is a different way to think about what is actually happening. I'd contend that Pentecostalism really isn't Protestantism at all, and that we need to begin to think about this in a much different way, because it is a fusion of spiritual traditions, it's a fusion of Catholicism. It has many different things going on. Mason even talks about reading the entrails to see the signs and wonders of God. And in one particular message that he gives, he talks about sexual spirits, succubus, coming to people in the middle of the night, and people having these kinds of issues and them needing prayer in the church. Now, this is not a normal Protestant sermon. Okay? But if you begin to read these narratives and look at what people are saying, especially in a lot of the Black Pentecostal traditions, you'll see a trajectory of spiritualism and spirituality and all these things, and people being really confused about what the Holy Spirit is and what another spirit is. And I think we have to begin to look at those in a different kind of way to speak to the myriad of ways that these traditions keep popping up in every one of these narratives and show us something different. Second, Maurice Rousseff. Maurice Rousseff was one of the first 4 black men who went into the seminary in 1921 in Biloxi, Mississippi. Sorry about that, Eddie. I know you're from Mississippi. It's a prominent Creole family in New Orleans. One of his sisters became a nun. His other brother became a Jesuit priest. He went in to seminary at the age of 14 to the Society for Divine Word in Greenville, Mississippi. He was ordained in 1934, and in 1941, he was sent to St. Martinsville, Louisiana, to Notre Dame of Perpetual Succours Church. And that church was established by Mother Catherine Drexel. Now, you might think, why are you telling a story about a black priest? It's not just a story about a black priest. It's about a story of an execution, the execution of Willie Francis. And if you know this story, this is one of the stories that went to the Supreme Court. Maurice Rousseff was Willie Francis's confessor. He heard his final confession. This was a young African-American man who had been accused of killing a pharmacist in St. Martinville, Louisiana. He probably didn't do it, but he was framed for it. And when they sent him to the electric chair the first time, which was located not somewhere far away, but right there in the center of town, in the courthouse, the electric chair didn't work. He was shocked. He was not killed. And so this case went to the Supreme Court, and Father Rousseff fought for this young man's life. And in that narrative, he talked about the kinds of racialized things that were happening. There was no black church that was strong enough to save anybody in St. Martinville, Louisiana. It was a black priest who had to testify. And so if we don't look for where these other stories might pop up and begin to see the myriad of ways of different kinds of clergy working, then we miss the story. Unfortunately, Willie Francis was put to death, and the second time he was electrocuted, he died. But Rousseff was in the middle of that story. Third story, very briefly. Johnny Coleman, some of you might know that name. She's the founder of United Christ Temple in Chicago, Illinois. She preached the science of mind and started a church in 1956. We talk about people like Father Divine. We talk about Reverend Ike. But Johnny Coleman should get the credit for having a church with one time over 20,000 members. She was probably one of the first mega churches past 1950. When she moved into the science of mind, she, like many other people who became clergy at this time, had a profound experience of illness, decided to start studying what her mother had been passing out to her in pamphlets, and became a preacher, and was into metaphysical thinking. We don't talk a lot about African Americans who embrace science of mind and have decided to turn away from traditional ways of thinking about Christianity. But all of these stories say something, and what do they say? They say, number one, that we should think about the ways in which this religious history, these religious complexes of African Americans who are practicing religion, are not these traditional stories of the preacher, the music, and the frenzy. I invoke Du Bois here because I think in many ways, although I love his work, that there has been a narrative that has cut out the voices of many others in this historical narrative of African American religion. If we miss these stories, we miss the whole point about what religion is in America. I've often thought about Henry McNeil Turner when he said, God is a black man. And you can draw a trajectory from Henry McNeil Turner to Father Divine, who says he is God. How do you go from a black man saying God is black to the black man saying he is God? We need to begin to consider and deconstruct and reconstruct our narrative so that we could have a clearer perspective about what African American religion really is. It's not just the preacher and the music and the frenzy. It's not just a beautiful hat. It's not just church mothers that I've written about. But it is a whole complex of religion that can connect us to a broader world of the African diaspora and beyond. Thank you.
I have a question for each one of you. And Eddie, I'd like to start with you. I understand what you were saying about categorizing African American religion. And the question that I'm about to ask probably you would not want to answer, but I'm going to make you answer it anyway. How does one, you have a black congregation and white leadership, okay? Is this an authentic African American religion, or it's just African American life, or it's an African American religious experience? To what extent does that white presence, especially in a leadership role, change the experience? I guess I'm asking.
We can actually concretize that. Father Flavor, right? Mm-hmm. In Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We can actually concretize that. Father Flager in Chicago, right? What is it? Saint Sabinus, right? There it is. And so part of what I'm trying to do by troubling the category is to say that it's precisely those sorts of experiences, those sorts of institutional realities that complicate some of the hidden assumptions about African American religion, because what we're trying to do at that moment is to kind of fit it into a kind of prior understanding of what an African American religious life actually entails. And so when we look at the complexity of African American religious life, we're going to see that, right? Now, what is at work on the part of the historian or the cultural critic to try to fit it into a category of African American religion is what I'm trying to interrogate, right? And I'm trying to push. And what gets lost in that moment when we have to ask ourselves, is it that or is it not? As opposed to just letting the looking at the experiences themselves and what's going on and what's happening at St. Sabinus and what is Father Pfleger doing with this kind of neo-Pentecostalized Catholicism and what's happening in this, right? But instead, we're trying to fit it into something called African American religion or fit it into something called Black church, right? And I want to say that something gets lost there, right? And let me just say this really quickly because I didn't go over 10 minutes.
That is true.
I just had to do that.
You can make it up now.
No, my mom. I felt my mother popping me upside the head. I wanted this is the Du Bois reference, right? Because in the paper I wrote, I talk about the Du Bois reference, right? And this preacher, the music and the frenzy, but Du Bois is really deliberate. We tend to read of the faith of the fathers as his definitive statement on African American religious life. But remember, at the end of that chapter, he calls for a new religious ideal. And then the next chapter is of the passing of the firstborn. And so I'm thinking that part of what Du Bois is actually doing is thinking about or treating African American churches, Christianity, as doing an institutional history. And then he's actually calling for a new religious ideal, and it might very well be embedded, right, in the way in which he's dealing with death, with the death of his son. So something is much more interesting happening there. And then I want to say this in terms of Bible politics, and I know you got some more questions, right, that there's contestation there. I'm thinking about Psalms. The Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God. I'm thinking about the ways in which Bible politics actually reflect not so much a commitment to America living up to its ideals or purifying America as such, but actually is the ground to reject America as such, right? And then the other element of Bible politics, Evelyn, is the rhetorical value of the Bible, right? That people might not be invested in the truth claims of the Bible, but like Emerson and others, they learn how to speak with the Bible. So is James Baldwin engaging in Bible politics? I don't know, but we know the Bible is everywhere.
Does there have to be a connection to institutionalized religion? Because we know that a lot of these black men and white men who are pursuing this are ministers, but not all are. And so does there have to be an affiliation with an institution, or just because you know the Bible and you think you know what God's plan is?
So for me, I make a distinction in the longer paper, I wouldn't include the Ethiopians as Bible politics, because I take literally this idea of the abolitionists who are saying that we are going to stay in America. In fact, that's one of their themes, that we're going to stay in America. Our blood has made this country. We're going to make it better. And then what they do is they draw on the, quote, sacred documents of our founding nation. So the reason, and I say, the different groups that don't fit into this type of Bible politics. And so I want people to understand that looking back at the past, looking even before that time, and then looking right up to the present. You can go to North Carolina for Moral Mondays. So this is a tradition, and I think it's a tradition that's worthy of talking about. But no, obviously you don't have to be a minister to have Bible politics. But what you do is you engage the political system through petitions like Absalom Jones did, through public writings like Lemuel Haynes or Martin Luther King. You challenge the system to live up to what it's supposed to do. Frederick Douglass was certainly not a minister. Neither was James McCune Smith, who's in this Bible politics. But they use literally the language of the Bible. They literally use Bible passages. They invoke God. If they're not invoking God, then I'm not calling. It's not as narrow. I'm being somewhat narrow here. But I do think it's a tradition that has a long history, and it's a tradition that has been. Now we think about it so much with the right that we don't realize how that tradition has been used all along as a counter-narrative to this other way that the Bible is used politically.
And Dr. Weisenfeld, I am intrigued with the case of Mary Wood and the idea that religion can be linked to mental illness, although I think some of us would recognize that connection, even had we not read your paper. But you indicate that there's a racialization of this whole thing. Did you find any instances of white patients being diagnosed with the same thing?
I'm really only just getting started on this, and it grows out of a previous project in which I was reading. I became very intrigued by the psychiatric literature about followers of Father Divine. And there was, by this time, an assumption that a man who calls himself God is, of course, crazy. But then psychiatrists, sociologists, and so on turned to think about who's following this man who says he's God. And the psychiatric literature was very distinctive in rehearsing a litany that goes something like the Negro is 3 generations removed from savagery, 2 generations removed from slavery, 1 generation removed from the rural South. And when I started to think about a broader context, I found a large set of psychiatric literature that does this same thing, that links diagnostic categories and practices to this cluster of ideas about savage religion, superstition, and so on. What I think is the case, although I haven't done the research to prove it, is that it was common in 19th century America for whites to be diagnosed with religious insanity, mania, melancholia. By the early 20th century, I think it's very narrowed to this racialized frame, that it becomes I'm interested in a kind of disciplinary frame, another carceral arena where religion gets used to contain certain things about African American life. I'm really just at the start of this. Yes, there are people in these institutions, in the little archival work I've done, who are not black, who have religion attached as a kind of predisposing factor or something else. But then when you locate that in the larger psychiatric frame, it's I was very surprised to find it.
And Dr. Butler, you mentioned something in your paper that I think is very important to emphasize here. You talked about the fact that we have records that could help us challenge that traditional narrative that everything is Protestant and it's church-based and all of the rest, but that those records are languishing in basements and in attics, and people who are tasked with having to clean out grandma's home after she's passed away are not predisposed to notice certain kinds of important documents that we should be preserving. What would be your advice to this audience about ensuring that we don't lose those important records?
First of all, if you know somebody that's older that is ill and they're about to clean out the house, go run over there and go grab everything. Just go buy a tub of something and go get it, because I can't tell you how much is being lost right now. And it's not just the papers and the print. It's the material culture of this. You know, if you see a bottle of holy water or oil or something, that's material. That's part of a story. And we need those stories. We don't have those stories. And, you know, I want to bring up something that has been, you know, a point for all of us, and Eddie will know what I'm about to say, this African American Religious Doc Project that started back in the 90s, and that's a long, torturous thing. And there are documents from 1444 to the 20th century that nobody's looked at or touched yet. And I think it's a tragedy, because there are so many dissertations and books that have not been written because that project was not out. And I've talked a lot about it, but I'm going to say it publicly now. If there's any way to get that out in the open, let's do it. Let's do it now, because it's past time for these stories to come out. And we really need it. And with now that we are going to have an African American museum on the mall, we need to begin to think about the next generation. You're looking at right now only, you know, a handful of people who teach in the area of African American religious history. 2 of us are sitting right next to each other. And we wonder about what our legacy is going to be. Not that we need a legacy, but the work needs a legacy. And if we're not training enough people and we don't have the materials that we need in order to train people, then the stories are gone. That's it.